Hello, Eric.
Hello, Martin, fellow human.
It's my Eric Bot 3000 that I purchased recently off the dark web.
Command not recognized. Executing trespass elimination.
No. Welcome back. Episode 2 of Between the Gigs. Do you have any gigs? Do you know of any gigs? Speaking of gigs, you are cordially invited to the Pangea Jazz Festival, August 23rd at 7 p.m. For reservations, call 212-995-0900. When you arrive, you will see the Wes Anderson Jazz Project, a project where we interpret the music that is in Wes Anderson films in a jazzy way. In this episode, I sit down with Eric Reeves, drummer, close friend of mine, constant collaborator, amateur astronomer. Eric and I make up the rhythm section that is the Like Minds Trio. We've played in a lot of bands together, spent a lot of time on the road together. Just two good old buddies. In this episode, we talk about our careers, our lives, and the creative challenges of being an improvising musician. So I hope you enjoy, and thanks for listening. Hello, everybody. This is Marty Eisenberg, and welcome to the second episode of my show, How Dare You? Which is our working title. I'm still working on a name for the show. Our guest today is my very good friend, Eric Reeves, who is a fantastic drummer here in New York. You may know him as Stick McTricks or Smooth McGroove, depending on what part of town you're from. There's a little joke that we have about Eric, and you'd never know by looking at him or talking to him or spending 5 minutes with him, but he's the coolest guy you'll ever meet.
Flattery will get you everywhere, Marty.
And he's also got a really good sense of humor, and I feel like for most people telling that joke, it would come off a little offensive, but he takes it in stride.
I keep my rage way down inside.
Good, that's where it belongs. Yeah. Okay, so basically, we're just gonna have a little chat here today about some topics in the music biz. I'd like to kind of quiz you on your background, your biography a little bit, because I think it's interesting. I think you have an interesting sort of perspective in the jazz world because both of your parents are also musicians, so you're coming from a musical family, and you are a very fun and interesting drummer to play with. And we work together a lot, so I know a lot about you. So this is going to be a fun chance for me to take a deeper dive into your psyche.
Let's do it.
All right. Tell me a little bit about, what it was like just growing up in a musical family.
Well, I think I lucked out in the upbringing department. First of all, I'm an only child, so Christmas presents galore, you know what I'm saying?
Lots of drumsticks.
New drumsticks every year. And so my dad, Scott Reeves, is an accomplished trombonist, alto valve trombonist, and alto flugelhornist.
Does he not play slide?
No, he plays slide.
Oh.
Yeah. Trombone implies regular.
Shut up.
We'll edit that part out.
No, leave it in. I want everyone to know what an asshole you are for correcting me on my own show. All right, please continue.
Yeah, so pedantry aside. And he's had teaching jobs all around the country, starting in Washington and Virginia, and then University of Southern Maine, where I grew up. My mother is also an accomplished pianist and vocalist, both in the jazz and classical world. And then they both currently live in upstate New York. My mother continues to play with the Portland, Maine Symphony Orchestra as one of the principal pianists there. So growing up in a musical household, first of all, I was also a pretty high-strung child. And
you were?
Yeah, believe it or not. And banging on things was a frequent outlet for getting rid of that excess nervous energy to the detriment of the integrity of some of our household furniture, I might add.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So my parents never really pushed music on me. I think my mom tried to give me some piano lessons when I was still in the single digit age, perhaps, and I just could not focus because I was such a brat. But eventually, I think they realized that percussion was probably going to be the direction I was gravitating towards. So they signed me up for some African drum lesson classes with this woman named Annegret Bayer, this German lady who had studied West African drumming. And I was still pretty young at the time. I was in middle school. And it did hurt my hands to play the djembe. You have to hit those things pretty hard, but it was tons of fun. I was also doing mallet percussion in the school band, but I wasn't super serious about music. It was more of a hobby. And I guess the older I got, when I was in college, sort of, became clearer and clearer to me that being a professional musician was the direction I wanted to go in life. So my parents never pushed it on me, but they were always very supportive, especially when I showed interest.
Do you think so? Because I teach a lot of kids, and do you think the experience of having your mom be your piano teacher might have been one of the reasons why it was hard for you to focus? Because I know, like, I have a niece, and like with my students at Clinton Hill Music School, like I'm very sort of like, I'm fun, but I'm very strict with them. I don't give up with them when they start goofing around. But when I tried to give my niece a lesson, like I can't, because it's she's family, and I don't feel the same impulse to like, I want her to love me more,
Yeah, no, I think that's a totally valid point there. I think it was the fact that it was my mom giving me the lesson. I just didn't want to, I was an undisciplined a-hole as a kid. However, like having a drum teacher who wasn't related to me by blood, then I felt the pangs of guilt more severely from having not practiced my lesson, for example.
Right. Yeah. Were you someone that always would prepare for your lessons, always practice week to week, or?
I refuse to incriminate myself. I have had, like all young children, self-discipline wasn't necessarily my strong suit at the time. That sort of came later, if it came at all.
Fair enough. So with your parents, I have some questions about them. Like, firstly, did it ever, I mean, maybe you didn't notice, but did you ever feel like they were sort of competing in their careers with each other? Like,
No, I don't think so. So, yeah, I should mention that they're both full-time, or not full-time currently. My mom's retired, but they've both been professors at the graduate level for many, many years. And they started teaching at Bellingham, Washington, which is where they first got their grad degrees. And then,
is that where they met?
They met at Indiana University when they were doing their undergrad, and then moved to California for a while, and gradually up the left coast.
Yep.
And then I mean, I can't speak for them, but I get the impression that, sometimes they taught at the same school, but I think my mom was kind of following my dad as he pursued better and better teaching jobs, and eventually getting him to where he teaches now, where he's doing his final semester at City College of New York in Harlem. When my parents moved to New York, my mom was teaching as an adjunct at William Patterson University.
Is
also a great school. She's since retired from teaching, but I don't think they were. Yeah, I don't think competition is the word. I mean, first of all, they're teaching different instruments.
Right.
So,
is there ever been a time when you saw your parents having to make decisions over what they wanted to do creatively that like affected the family?
They've always had a pretty collaborative relationship, I would say.
Great, yeah.
So my dad is also an accomplished composer and arranger, and he frequently uses my mom as his go-to editor.
Ah, that's cute.
So she's got a really good ear
Yeah.
for arranging and voicing and harmony and just a really deep knowledge of that subject.
Yeah.
And, you know, you've always got to, you always need another pair of ears to really get perspective on, you know,
Absolutely.
what you're writing. So my dad always gets help from my mom. She should have co-author credit. That's right, Mom, if you're listening.
Oh, I'm sure the moms are listening. This podcast is really, it's for moms.
It's probably exclusively your mom is the only person that's ever going to listen to this.
Maybe your mom. I hope your mom will listen. I'm hoping all the moms of my guest hosts will listen. That's really who this is for.
Okay, this one's for the moms.
Okay, cool. So, you went off to college, and eventually you landed in Vermont, in Burlington, right after graduating school, which is where you spent how many years?
That is correct. I lived in Burlington, Vermont for 3 years after having graduated. Well, graduated, quote unquote.
Quote unquote.
I did flunk math, so I had to
Oh.
take statistics online to get my diploma after I was supposed to have graduated.
And you didn't major in jazz, right? You did anthropology?
Well, you know, I kind of switched back and forth and even contemplated doing a double major for a while, but I was taking drum lessons and jazz band classes and basic music theory. I didn't actually get enough credits to finish a music degree because I was also majoring in anthropology at the time, sort of with the thinking that I was still unsure exactly what my, you know, professional path was going to be. Maybe I wanted to go into academia or even ethnomusicology. But after 4 years of undergrad, I guess maybe it's the aforementioned lack of self-discipline, but I was starting to feel a little burnt out by school.
Right.
And so then I kind of realized that the thing that brought me joy the most was just playing.
And where do all burnouts go to? Burlington, baby.
Yeah, no, that's a great, I mean, yeah, it's kind of like the Portland, Oregon of the of the East Coast.
Yeah.
It was a groovy town, and I met some great musicians there that currently live there that are kind of the vanguards of the jazz scene, like trumpeter Ray Vega, originally from the Bronx.
And he was kind of a mentor to you.
He
right?
was. I didn't go to college there, and because he teaches at UVM, but you know, that guy's got a big heart and is definitely invested in helping out young people who are interested in music. So he had a little quintet made of just some local schmoes like myself, some of them associated with college, some of them not. And, you know, I got the honor of getting my butt kicked by him on a weekly basis for
That's
a while.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really nice because we're sort of in a generation now for jazz musicians where, you know, back in the day when you had your chops together, you'd, you know, if you were lucky enough to, you'd get on the road with some, you know, musician who would, you know, teach you how to like live the life and you know, teach you what was important about playing. And that has sort of transitioned to something that you're learning in school now. And I feel like a lot of people that come directly to New York City after they finish school and just kind of try to make it without that mentorship, it's a different experience now, and it's kind of has its own set of challenges. But you know, that's cool that you got to have that experience. You know.
Yeah. Well, I think that you know, there are certain trades that you can only hit the books
right
so much, and that, you know, I think apprenticeship is a valuable learning method, especially in a trade like this, where not only are you, you know, getting your grasp of music theory and all that stuff, but your book learning, but just knowing how to play with other people and knowing how to be a good accompanist if you're in the rhythm section, and also just certain music business things like, you know, you better work on your punctuality if you want to make it in that world, and being prepared and doing your homework. If you got a bunch of hard music to learn, you better show up to the rehearsal ready to do it, you know. And those are some things that are learned more experientially, and I think it really helps to have someone who's crossed that river sort of help guide you through it and point you in the right direction.
And you know, someday we're gonna be the shepherds.
Because we're so old here, Marty, being
I know,
in our early 30s, right? I mean, I would still feel rather presumptuous giving someone who wasn't a student casual advice.
Well, that's the thing that they need the most from us. You know, we shouldn't be necessarily telling them what solos to transcribe.
Yeah,
and
but
stuff
I've still got a lot to learn too.
You can tell someone to show up on time. Or
I think the showing up on
politics,
I've grasped the importance of showing up on time.
Yeah, dressing the right way. I did a New Year's Eve gig one time where this kind of young guy was the drummer. And
wait, was that a gig I was on?
No. I mean, I didn't do a gig. I would never do a gig without you, Eric. And the guy came in, like, the dress code was tuxedos, and he came in wearing like a black blazer with a white shirt without a tie or anything. And he asked the singer, like, "Oh, how do I look?" And she's like, "You're not wearing a tuxedo." And he was like going around to everyone else in the band, like, "Do you guys have a tuxedo I could borrow?" Like,
oh my God. How well, I once missed out on a gig because I didn't have a tuxedo, and understandably, he had to go with someone else.
Young people, get yourself a tuxedo.
So I got a tuxedo.
Yeah.
And I've never gotten a call for a tuxedo gig since, but it's in the closet. It's ready to go. Should have come in handy one day.
Well, so getting back to Vermont, did you, now that you've had some time to sort of reflect on your youth, did you feel like it was the right choice for you, or maybe your advice for someone else, to go to another city before coming to New York, if your ultimate plan is to come to New York?
Yeah, well, my drum teacher at SUNY Plattsburgh, Gabe Jarrett, once told me that you're never ready for New York.
Right.
Because I was at the time, I was sort of debating, well, should I just go straight to the city? My dad works there.
Yeah.
It seems like a logical step. On the other hand, I was a little intimidated.
Mm-hmm.
And I also thought that Burlington seemed like maybe a good place to dip into the tepid waters on a smaller scene.
Yeah.
I think either way, you're going to get your butt kicked when you first move to the city, no matter where you come from. It's just another level. Mm-hmm. That being said, I'm glad that I didn't spend more time than I did there, because there's only so much growing you can do unless you put plunge, you got to put yourself in challenging situations sooner or later. So I don't know. Do I regret it? I don't think so. It was, part of my life experience. It's not like I can go back and do things differently now anyway. So
sure.
I have no regrets.
Yeah. I guess sort of at the core of that question is like, is it, I mean, you're right. You're never ready until you get here, and to sit on the fence is prevents growth. But for some people I know that came to New York at a point where they already were ready to like play and like be on any scene, any gig, sometimes did better than the people that showed up to New York and just got their butts kicked for years, because you never really shake that reputation of when you first get here.
That's a good point. You don't want to go up and just your first splash is an absolute belly flop.
Right. Well, I mean, you kind of do too, because like that's a great learning experience, but I guess there's consequences to it.
Yeah, I guess it's a little of column A, a little of column B. There's going to be butt kicking, but you can harden yourself beforehand a little bit, I think. That being said, there's nothing like the New York experience. But yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I don't know, just something I think
about. If you come here too young, then you might make a bad first impression, and that's how people will be thinking of you.
Yeah. Well, I came here for school, so I was here at 17 years old. And
so you made plenty of bad first impressions.
All bad. They were all
exclusively bad.
Yeah, exclusively bad. And it's probably sort of conditioned my psyche in a certain way to like think of myself not as good as other players, even though like I've sort of overcome that over the years.
Yeah.
It's still something, but maybe that's just part of the human experience. I don't know.
Well, I think that is part of the challenge of this craft, is that there's sort of always the temptation to compare yourself to others, and to a certain point that's valid, because ultimately, it's all subjective, right? So how do you decide who's good at the instrument? Well, you look at the top virtuoso and how they play and what they're doing, and you learn from them. On the other hand, no two musicians are going to do things exactly the same, because you're also, especially in something like jazz, where there's so much emphasis around individual personality. I would say even more so than bands. That's why it's always the Marty Eisenberg quintet or whatever. No one has. It's kind of a very. I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but there's definitely a matter of ego.
Oh, there 100% is.
And especially for the trumpet players. But I think that ultimately that ego ends up being one of the biggest obstacles to really mastering the craft and getting far in it. You do need to have perspective of how far along you are in your growth and your development, and sometimes that involves comparisons, but there's a danger of getting too caught up in that, and too obsessed over, essentially artistic vanity. And why did this guy have a gig? Even feelings of jealousy. Those are ultimately, it becomes detrimental if you go too far. You need to put the music first. We're just vessels that the music is flowing through. We're just a way for the music to manifest itself. But no one person invented music. It's everyone else is borrowing from the person before them and the person before them. And if it wasn't for Bach, we wouldn't have equal temperament on the piano. And if it wasn't for Miles Davis, we wouldn't have this and that. And then so everyone's contributed something. It's greater than any one person. It's an entire artistic entity of its own that has to come before your individual arrogance, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that kind of brings me to a couple questions I have for you, just sort of about identity in music and individuality and labels and things like that. Would you define yourself as a jazz musician?
Well, that's interesting, because my website, ericreevesjazz.com, which also is not regularly updated these days, I'm ashamed to say. But the reason I chose ericreevesjazz.com was because ericreevesmusic.com was already taken.
Motherfucker.
And I would have had to pay for it. So
actually, that reminds me of the when I met Eric like 5 or 6 years ago. I was invited to a jam session by Albert Marquez, great piano player here in New York, and it said that he had Eric Reeves in his band, and I thought it was Eric Reeves, the bass player.
I get that.
Yeah. So, all right. So,
but to answer your question, jazz is what I grew up listening to, and I would say it's sort of my first love. It's what really got me into music, and there are a lot of things that I love about it. In particular, I like the improvisational aspect. I like the emphasis on creativity and sort of in the moment, spontaneous creation. On the other hand, I wouldn't like to limit myself to any one particular genre, because ultimately all those lines are blurry anyway. What do you call jazz? Do you take a very narrow definition and say, oh, it just has to be, any music written before this era or whatever, or do you,
does it have to
or
swing,
do you
or
broaden
does
it so much
elements?
that it's almost meaningless? Because then you could say, oh, well, any music that has soloing is jazz, right? So it's all kind of arbitrary how we draw those lines, and jazz is also constantly being influenced by its, adjacent traditions. I mean, just look at so-called Latin jazz, and how many different influences have integrated and mixed with the genre. And because it's these days such an international music, even though obviously originally it's an American tradition, but because it's spread around the world, there's very much a melting pot phenomenon. And if you go to Europe, you'll hear sort of a different stylistic interpretation of certain things, and in Japan as well. Everyone's got kind of their own take on it, and I think the music as a whole benefits from having that that
100%.
diversity in the music. So I think we shouldn't be afraid about labeling it this or labeling it that. Ultimately, just play what you hear, play what you want to play, and that's all there is to it, I think.
So, with that in mind, have you thought about like what a successful career for you is? I mean, I know it's a question that sort of is always developing and in flux, but so what does that sort of look like to you right now?
Well, I mean, in terms of career, there's fulfillment and then there's finance, right? And these are sometimes not necessarily, in harmony with each other.
Right.
So you got to pay rent, obviously. Yeah. And a lot of musicians, they have teaching jobs, they have side gigs. I've done a lot of side gigs. I've never just exclusively made money from music full time. I've always had something else to accompany it.
Right.
And I'm okay with that because, I don't want to say I'm like okay with it, but I have come to terms with the fact that it's very difficult to just play for a living in this world. Very few reach that level. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if you don't get there, because it's just so hard to get there. You have to be a little forgiving with yourself given the environment that you're in.
Yeah.
So yeah, you got to be able to pay rent. I guess really first and foremost, what I want out of the career is the fulfillment aspect. I want to be able to play music as much as possible because it's something I enjoy. I want to be put in new, challenging situations. I love the social aspect of it. I love meeting people, meeting new people, and it's such a big town, but it's such a small community. You see the same guys showing up at this gig or whatever. And, it's a great way to make friends and develop personal relationships. And I think as long as I can manage to scrape by with the rent aspect, let's be frank here, Marty, I'm married as well. So,
Oh, that's another potential podcast listener for me is also wives of guests.
Oh, well,
partners.
If she hasn't gotten bored by this point, I'll give her
stick with us.
A shout out to
getting better, I promise.
My lovely and brilliant wife. Yeah, well, this is just the second podcast.
Yeah, come on, Anna.
We're learning.
We're learning. How much energy do you devote into sort of thinking about your sound and your identity in the music that you perform?
That's an interesting question.
Thank you.
I think I think that when I was first starting out, when I was younger, I didn't really know what kind of drummer I wanted to be. I know there are drummers I like that I'm inspired by. I always loved Elvin. In terms of contemporary guys, I like Bill Stewart, Billy Martin from the band Medeski, Martin and Wood. He was an early influence. I even took a lesson with him once, and I think his approach to drumming is very unique. His sort of drum storytelling, conceptual elements. But it's hard to... You don't want to peg yourself into a corner too soon. I think it's good to keep your mind open and embrace...
Are you saying stylistically, or are you
saying...
stylistically,
in terms of, what kind of drummer do I want to be? Well, I'm not even sure you really end up choosing what kind of musician you want to be, because what defines your musical style? Well, it's partly geared by your ability level, but also by your personality, and you don't really deliberately choose the way your personality is wired. It happens because of environment and circumstance, and you happen to be in a certain place, or you're exposed to this at the right time. It changes the way you think. So we don't really have control over our own personality. We want the things that we want because they because of circumstance, cause and effect. uh, obviously we do make deliberate choices about, oh, well, I want to do this, but we want to do the things because we've been exposed to certain styles that for whatever reason, the aesthetic resonates with us. So I think it's kind of a waste of time to get too caught up in worrying about that, because it'll just manifest on its own. Your voice will just sort of come through naturally, I think. And I've still got a lot to learn. I'm still relatively young, but I do feel sort of, certain stylistic tendencies becoming more materialized as I develop. But I also would, I think we'll also change over time. We'll never stop changing. I mean, if anything, it's refreshing and healthy to keep experimenting, and maybe you change your sound. Some of my favorite musicians are precisely so, because every next album is going to sound a little different. Look at how much Miles experimented and changed his style.
I think that Miles was someone who thought a lot about sort of his vision, or his who he wanted to be in the music.
Yeah, I suppose you're right. I can only speak for myself in this matter.
Do you think that your sound and your style, would you wrap up how, like, you're in talking about your sound, your touch, like the way that you activate the instrument, is that, do you have the same approach to that as you feel about stylistically, or is that something very specific that's...
Well, I think the way you play and the technique you use influences how you sound and what your style sounds like. So I think they're
style and sound are kind of synonymous for you.
Well, they're two sides of the same coin, perhaps.
I have sort of an example I thought might be interesting, is when we were playing in so Eric and I have a trio together with the fantastic guitarist Dave Juarez. We play together a lot. We play together. And we were doing a gig of Dave's music when he was leading a quintet. And we were playing this tune that was in an odd meter. And I mean, one of the things that works between the three of us as a band, I think, is that Dave and I are always sort of like butting heads and like creating like tension. And it's kind of like this very sort of tumultuous, but like, fertile ground for, sort of like
you both have strong presences on the
which
on
is
the
why
stage,
it's very nice to have you in the band, because you can sort of like, without jumping into the fray and like, calling off the fight, like you find a way to sort of create space for each of us to like do what we want to do.
Well, the drums are kind of the glue that holds everything together.
Yeah. And there's probably something about the personality of a drummer, and also a bass player in most cases, that like want to be that in a band, or just are naturally that way.
Well, what that reminds me of? It's somewhat tangentially related, but in terms of assertiveness on stage.
Right.
This has been something that I've struggled to find the perfect balance for.
Right.
Because
I think everyone does, but go on. I'm interested in this.
Yeah. On one hand, like, let's say you're ending a tune, right? You want to look at the soloist, and if they're clearly going for a 3x tag, or want to keep it going on a vamp or something, you got to pay attention to what they're doing and follow them along. But sometimes they don't know what they want to do.
Right.
Sometimes the soloist is just as confused as everybody else.
Right.
And they're all looking to each other for, oh, crap, how do we get out of this tune? And sometimes it's necessary, I think, for the drummer in particular because the drummer's kind of driving the train in a sense, right? To just take the bull by the horns and just make the ending happen. Because if there's one thing that makes me feel ashamed the most, it's when there's a weak ending.
Oh, yeah.
You got to have a strong ending. But endings are, I've been thinking about this. Endings are like some of the hardest parts.
They're not talked about.
Yeah, they're not talked about. They're inherently unrehearsed.
Yeah.
Well, unless you rehearse the ending.
Right. Yeah, that's a
I guess
thing.
when you're just playing tunes, though, everyone has their own way of approaching them. On the other hand, you can go too far with that, and then you restrict the other players. Maybe they wanted to keep the vamp going longer, and you ended it too soon. So there's a very delicate balance between propelling things forward in an assertive manner that's still supportive without being overpowering and still giving maximum freedom to the soloists and the rest of the band.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about sort of personal relationships and just knowing what the other person wants. And, it's if you're playing with someone who's assertive, your probably first assumption is that they're going to lead the ending. And if you're playing with someone that's not, then, you might need to step up,
Well, that's the risk of the kind of art form we're doing, right? The perils of improvisation.
Right.
Reward doesn't come without some danger,
Yeah.
right? And, I mean, I don't know if you've checked out some Hal Galper lectures, but
does he talk about endings?
He talks about being a risk taker in his playing, and I won't even attempt to paraphrase. Just go on YouTube, look it up.
Look it up, Mom.
But in general, I think sort of the point is that you should be willing to go into uncharted territories, and
if you do it all the time, if you force your way in all the time, people are going to be like annoyed.
Yeah, you want to do it in a constructive way, but if you don't take a little risk, then there's not as much reward.
Yeah. So getting back to the whole identity thing I was talking about before. So we're in this rehearsal with Dave's band, and Dave is essentially telling me how he wants me to play this bass line for his song, or I had come up with something organically and he didn't like it, and he was sort of saying to do something else. And I think that the way that we both reacted in that situation is sort of interesting. Like, I want to, you were saying basically, like, as a sideman, like, Dave's the leader, like, let's do whatever. This is Dave's gig. He wants something. That's our job. Like, we should do it, And I feel like, depending on the gig, if I'm on a Broadway gig, the amount of creative liberty I'm going to take is like 0 to 3%. And not to say those jobs aren't creative. That's another discussion.
You got to play the ink, though.
Yeah, you got to play the ink. That's the job, and you're being paid well to do that. If I'm on a gig that I consider creative, like, I very much want to play what I want to play. And it has to fit, obviously. If I'm just like playing in thumb position over like somebody else soloing, that's wrong. I mean, it's arbitrary, and it served the music, And I'm not saying what Dave wanted me to do was wrong either. And, if I didn't have an ego, I might have more easily been receptive to doing what he did. And in the end of the day, I think I did anyway. But I very much view my role in a band is to be a supportive base for the other musicians, but it's also important to me to contribute my own unique voice on the music. So I'm not just playing the fundamental role that any other bass player could play. Whereas I think your approach to being a sideman is more relaxed. Like, what I'm gathering from this discussion is you feel like your unconscious decisions will imprint Eric Reeves on the music, and even if you get direction, you're cool with that.
Well, I
Would
try
you say
to.
that's true or
Yeah,
false?
I want to be as adaptable as possible. I want to be. I'm probably never going to be a master at one thing, so I might as well be mediocre at everything, right?
Well,
no, I want to learn
that's
to.
not fair.
I want to learn to be flexible depending on the situation. You know, if you're playing a rock gig, you're not going to play the same way as you would play on a jazz gig.
Right.
Certain concepts carry over, obviously, but one of my great drum mentors, Diego Voglino, once told me, "Fills for show, grooves for dough." Which
That's so great, and what's so great about it is that it rhymes.
Right. I mean,
have you thought at all about putting out a record as a leader?
Yeah, I've thought about it, and it's definitely on the agenda. I think I'm still sort of figuring out what I want to do. I write some electronic music too, and I don't think I would want to make just like a straight ahead jazz record, because there are already so many people that can do that so well. And I also don't claim to necessarily be a master composer. Mostly just kind of write from ear, honestly. I mean, probably not a huge surprise as a drummer, but I just kind
I
of
don't
go
think
with my
it's-
instincts.
Yeah, I think that's part. Like at some point in the history of this music, the role of composer has been sort of foisted on every musician. And in a good way, in a way that like everybody gets to have a voice and stuff. But
I know that whatever I make, there's got to be synthesizers in it. It's got to have a space age sound.
Oh,
That's
man.
because there's definitely a certain. I want to go sort of maybe like an electric fusion-y route, but maybe we should edit that out, because if I end up making a straight ahead record, then this will not be relevant anymore.
No,
So I'm open to whatever. It's definitely something I want to do. I feel like I have dabbled in being a band leader, not particularly frequently, but you
led a session at Park Slope. What's it called? It before fifth state.
yeah,
Before it
some
closed.
early set there, and
Yeah.
I had some Eric Reeves quintet gigs
Yeah.
back in the day. I think before I met you, even.
No,
but,
I did a couple of those with you.
oh yeah, no, you did.
Yeah.
But I am still feeling like I'm figuring out how to be a sideman really well before I can become a great band leader.
Why is that? Is that just you can't juggle the two things at once, or do you feel like you need to be a great sideman before you can be a leader?
Well, I think it helps. I think it helps give you perspective. And, if you're playing in a band with someone that doesn't have much sideman experience, I think it shows in terms of
100%.
You want to make it easy on your sideman. You don't want to make it more difficult than is necessary to play the music. There's certain courtesies of even just how you write out the music and stuff like that that will bring you greater success if you take care of your sidemen, but also I'm not in a big rush. I'm still trying to get better, and if I release something, if I make a project too early, I might regret it later. Although I guess
It's kind of comes back to our discussion about when you're ready for New York. You're kind of never ready to make a record.
maybe your first record is just always going to be a throwaway, no matter what.
Or the greatest thing ever.
Yeah, unless you're Herbie Hancock.
Yeah. So what do you I guess if you were making a record or thinking about being a leader, like what sort of do you look for in a creative collaborator? Like let's just start more general at first, and then maybe specifically like a horn player. Or
probably someone who's really good at programming synthesizers.
Yeah, that is a skill.
No, it is. I'm only half joking too.
I really wish I knew somebody who was good at that.
Yeah. Well, what do I look for? Well,
Let's talk about jazz.
yeah.
Maybe that's the name of the podcast. Let's talk about jazz.
Let's talk about jazz, baby.
I came up with a couple podcast names for you, by the way. I'm really struggling to find a good one for myself, but I came up with a couple ideas for Eric.
Oh, if I had a podcast.
Yeah. One of them would be Game of Drum Thrones.
Nice.
And
I
if
like that.
you play the Game of Drum Thrones,
Ba-dum-tsh.
you win or you die. And then Reeves Peeves with Eric Reeves.
Yeah, well, that's more of like a Facebook special edition report.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it could be if it was frequent enough. You could host Reeves Peeves.
They include such topics as when your brushes get bent wires and
I know you hate that.
sympathetic snare drum rattling.
Oh my god. Also, speaking of sympathetic snare drum, which is there's nothing
That's a
there.
great name for a podcast
Is it?
right there. This
I guess I'll have to think about
No,
that.
just kidding. Edit that out.
All right, it's gone. Cut. Give me some skin with Eric Reeves.
Give me some skin.
Yeah.
Slapping the skin.
Slapping the skin.
Yeah.
Maybe not that one. All right, moving on. We were talking about creative collaborators. So in terms of what you look for in like a jazz musician, like someone that you would like to collaborate, and not someone specific, sort of what they bring to the table.
Just conceptually speaking.
Conceptually.
Yeah. Well, people who play creatively and listen well and are, I think it's great when a band feels like it's really collaborative endeavor. Like one of my favorite bands to listen to right now is Knee Body, and those guys clearly it's not just the so and so quintet. It sounds like a real band, and if I were leading a band, I would want it to sound as much as possible like everyone's voice is coming through in a way to sort of make the music as a whole instead of just one soloist, especially because I'm not a soloist in the sense that I'm a rhythm section member. And, you know, one of my primary concerns is how to be a good accompanist. And obviously I take drum solos from time to time, but I would kind of like it to sound like a cohesive unit that's
totally
working
agree.
together to create the music, as opposed to just a leader being accompanied by sidemen.
Yeah, there's nothing I hate more than accompanying a solo. You know, like
You mean in general? You mean
I'm
like
talking about,
walking
like,
a bass line?
as someone that doesn't leave any space for you to influence what he's trying to say.
Oh, sure.
You
Well,
know?
one great thing about playing with horn players is that unless they can circular breathe, they have to take a break every once in a while or they're passed
but
out.
Saxophone players, I mean, come on. A lot of them don't.
They seem to have incredible lung capacity,
Yeah.
some of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? That's a great point because, I mean, listen to Miles. How much space did he leave for his rhythm section?
Yeah, and it's captivating, you know?
Right.
Like,
That's a group that really, Miles Quintet, I mean, all his groups, but especially ESP and those records, it really sounds like a cohesive band.
Yeah.
It's not just Miles being accompanied. The rhythm section, Tony Williams is as much a leader as anyone else in that group in the way he propels the music forward.
Yeah. Do you think I should have changed my name for show business?
Mac McDuff? Was that what you were going to go for your elevator music band?
Oh yeah, the elevator music band. We were trying to make music for elevators, you know, like smooth jazz that only gets played in elevators.
You know, don't restrict yourself to elevators. There's also bank lobbies.
Oh, bank lobbies.
And don't forget
phone lines,
bathrooms.
You know? Oh yeah, yeah. I definitely should have changed my name for bathrooms.
Right. I want to hear some slick, smooth jazz while I pee. Helps the flow.
Yeah.
All right, we'll edit that out.
This podcast, there's not gonna be much left after we edit it down. I'm running out of questions here. Tell me something interesting that's happening in science.
Well, I guess we're now officially a multifaceted podcast. Huh?
Well, I can't have Eric Reeves on without asking him a astronomy related question, because that is really, I think, your true passion.
Yeah, well, I've always had an interest in astronomy and cosmology and just sort of philosophy in general, and I think that yearning partly also comes from my dad's influence, because he's an avid amateur astronomer, a builder of telescopes. In fact, he's gotten pretty sophisticated with it. And it makes sense because, especially if you listen to the way he writes and arranges, he's very meticulous about his craftsmanship. And he takes the same approach to his musical writing that he does to building his telescopes. He measures everything out very carefully. Sometimes he has to take something apart and start over again if he made a mistake. He's never in a rush to get out the product. He'll make sure it's finely tuned, test it out many times. And, you know, I think part of so growing up in Maine, we had pretty dark skies. When we moved to Nyack when I was in high school, obviously not as much, although there is a Rockland County astronomy club. But I think that there is a similar transcendent yearning in the pursuit of science that is the same as with art as well. I think that art and science both represent a transcendent yearning, that human beings are sort of biologically programmed to be explorers. You know, I mean, we start off with the frontier of the plains in Africa, the horizon all around us. If food runs out, you got to move to a new location. If it gets too cold, you carry on. You know, we're sort of nomadic by nature. And now, hey, I'm surprised if that would not be taken already, actually.
Let's have the interns Google that for us. Interns? They'll get back to us.
But basically, oh geez, I lost my train of thought. No, I think our sort of intrinsic yearning to just seek out new stuff, to seek out novelties. We need our brains to be stimulated, and we need to find what the next river to cross is. And music is sort of a way, music and art is a way to sort of explore the internal, the subjective experience, the passage of time, the moment, sort of almost like a Zen-like pursuit akin to meditation, when you get in the zone, right? When you're playing and all the other thoughts from your mind are clear and you're completely immersed in the music. I think that's a transcendent experience, which is akin to gazing up into the celestial void and feeling like we're part of something much greater than ourselves, part of an infinitely vast cosmos. It's very humbling. The more, there's always been this trend toward, because we're very ego-driven creatures, Man in his arrogance has long thought that he was the center of the world and that the heavens were created for humanity. And the more we learn, the more we find out that it's quite the opposite, that there's nothing particularly special about this particular region of the galaxy, and it's one of hundreds of billions of galaxies. And the more we learn, the more we find this universe was not made for us, but here we are. And even if though no purpose to life is apparent on its own, we also have the power to create our own purpose and to create our own path. And we do live in this vast cosmos, but it's ripe for exploration. And I think so. It's okay to feel small because it can be inspiring as well. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. That's a little rambly, but I think that music and science are both trying to explore certain truths of nature. And astronomy, they're looking at for empirical, objective stuff about the way the universe is, and then with art, we're exploring the subjective. We're exploring the mind and consciousness and how that works and how we relate to the environment. I think they're both equally important and something that should be, both of them, which are severely neglected in our educational system.
Yeah, totally. And with that, I think we are going to say goodbye to all you lovely people out there. Thank you for listening. In our next episode I'm doing is going to be my Soul Doctor episode, where we talk about that beautiful, disastrous tour of complete ineptitude. And it's going to be a really fun conversation.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Buddy.
Yeah. Anyway, this is Marty Eisenberg saying, smell you later.
All right, thanks for having me on.
Oh, yeah, Eric Reeves or whatever. Thanks. Our theme music was composed by Dave Fugel. Thanks again to the companies whose products I endorse: Fender, Aguilar, DR Strings, and Radial Engineering. You can catch the Like Minds Trio with Sammy Stevens every Monday at the Sky Deck of the Lifetime Athletic in Times Square, 605 West 42nd Street. We play up on a rooftop with a bar and a pool and Instagram influencers. It's pretty cool. Anyway, thanks for listening.